young woman said goodnight to her boyfriend at her own front door, walked back inside her family's house, and was never seen alive again. No broken locks, no screams anyone heard, no sign of a struggle, just an empty bed that had never been slept in, and a pair of shoes left sitting by an open gate. For over a month, an entire country searched for her, convinced her own boyfriend was the only man who could have done it. They were wrong. The truth was standing on the other side of a hedge the whole time. Alicia Ross was born on February 8, 1980, and adopted just 3 days later by Sharon and Marvin Ross, who raised her in Markham, Ontario, a fast-growing suburb just north of Toronto. Alicia grew up close with her adoptive family, and even after her parents' marriage ended, she stayed rooted in Markham with her mother Sharon, who later remarried and became Sharon Fortis. Alicia kept a warm relationship with her biological father too, splitting time between both households as a kid. She grew into an outdoorsy, driven young woman. She studied geography at Concordia University in Montreal, and by her mid-20s she'd landed a sales job at Hewlett-Packard's Canadian offices near Mississauga. Co-workers described her as sharp and ambitious, the kind of employee who was already being talked about for a promotion less than 2 years into the job. Friends remembered her as outspoken and physically confident too. She'd studied some martial arts in her younger years, the kind of detail that would later feel almost cruelly ironic given what was coming. She was still living at home when the case began, but at home didn't mean cramped or dependent. Sharon and her husband had converted the basement of their house into a self-contained apartment for Alicia, complete with its own separate entrance, so their daughter could have real independence while still being 20 feet from family. It was the kind of setup that let a 25-year-old build an adult life without leaving the people who loved her. By August of 2005, everything in Alicia's world seemed to be lining up. She had the promotion coming. She had the apartment. And for about 6 weeks, she'd been dating a man named Sean Hine, 29 years old, and by every account her mother's included, the relationship was going well. On the evening of August 16, 2005, Alicia and her mother took the family dogs for a walk after work. Alicia was practically glowing. She'd just found out, unofficially, that her promotion at HP was about to be announced. Sharon wasn't surprised in the slightest. She'd watched her daughter work for exactly this. Later that night, Sean Hine came over to celebrate with her. The two of them hung out in Alicia's basement apartment, played some pool, talked about a weekend trip they were planning together. Around midnight, Sean got up to leave. Alicia walked him out to his car. They said goodnight, and he watched her in his rearview mirror as he pulled away. That was the last confirmed sighting of Alicia Ross. Sean tried calling her cell phone once he got home. No answer. He assumed she'd gone straight to bed and didn't think much of it until the next morning, when he called again around 10 and still got nothing. That was strange enough on its own, but it was made worse by the calendar. This was the day of her promotion. Alicia would never have slept through it. Sean drove to the house. Her car was still parked in the driveway. Nobody answered the door. He walked around to the back and found the gate to the yard standing open, and on the ground near it, her shoes, a coffee cup, and a pack of cigarettes, just left there. That was enough to make him call 911. Sean then phoned Sharon and her husband, who rushed home to find their street already filling with York Regional Police cruisers. Inside the house, officers found something that made the case immediately unsettling. Alicia's bed hadn't been slept in. Laundry she'd washed the night before was still sitting out, folded, waiting to be put away. Her purse, her keys, her cigarettes, her cell phone, all still inside. Nothing was missing except Alicia herself. It looked less like someone who had walked away, and much more like someone who had been standing outside her own back gate and simply vanished into the dark. Investigators quickly ruled out the idea that Alicia had left on her own. With no clear point of entry disturbed and no sign of forced entry into the house, and with her shoes abandoned right by that open gate, detectives leaned hard toward abduction and toward a narrow window of opportunity. Sean had said goodnight to her around midnight. He'd tried calling her 15 minutes later and gotten nothing. That gave police a window of roughly 15 minutes in which someone could have taken her, right there in her own backyard, without a single neighbor hearing a thing. With no forced entry, no witnesses, and no physical trail, police turned to the obvious starting point. Sean Hine, the last person to see her alive. His car and home were searched. Nothing came up. Detectives even canvassed his neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen him taking out trash in the middle of the night, anything that might hint at a cover-up. Nothing. Investigators went a step further and drove out to a cottage Sean's family owned, hours north, in Halliburton, checking whether anything there connected him to Alicia's disappearance. Again, nothing. The relationship, by every account from friends and family, was healthy and new and happy. There was no motive detectives could find. A senior investigator on the case, Inspector Tom Carrique, told reporters flatly that Sean was not a suspect. He was a witness that potentially has valuable information for us. The public wasn't ready to believe that. Meanwhile, the search for Alicia exploded into one of the largest missing persons operations in Ontario's history. York Regional Police set up a command post inside a local school in Thornhill, using the building while it sat empty for summer break. Search dogs, helicopters, hundreds of volunteers combing green spaces and ravines. The case even drew coverage on the American program, America's Most Wanted. Interest was so intense that police actually had to turn volunteers away and cap it at around 100 a day, simply because they didn't have the manpower to manage the crowd safely. Two things kept the story burning nationally and internationally. First, the sheer impossibility of it, a healthy, cautious 25-year-old vanishing from her own fenced backyard, 10 feet from her mother's house, without a single sound. And second, the public's growing obsession with Sean Hine. Amateur sleuths and tabloids alike couldn't let go of the fact that he was the last one to see her, and the story only got more fuel when in late August, the National Post reported that Sean had stopped fully cooperating with investigators and had refused to take a polygraph test. Reporters pressed him directly, and he admitted what everyone already suspected. He believed he was the prime suspect. Behind the scenes, though, he was reportedly still calling Sharon privately, telling her how much he missed Alicia, and asking how she was holding up a detail that never made it into most of the headlines painting him as a killer. By September 2nd, the school being used as command post had to reopen for the fall term, and police were forced to dismantle their post. Weeks passed. A tip hotline brought in hundreds of calls. None of them led anywhere. Investigators quietly began entertaining a darker theory that whoever took Alicia might not be a stranger at all, but someone who knew her, someone who could get close enough that she never had reason to scream. They had no idea how right and how close to home that theory actually was. On September 20th, 2005, more than a month after Alicia disappeared, a man walked into York Regional Police Headquarters with his lawyer at his side. He told officers he was involved in Alicia Ross's disappearance. Then he said 4 words that changed the entire case. She died at my hands. The man was Daniel Sylvester, 31 years old. He didn't just live in the neighborhood. He lived right next door his house, separated from the Fortis family's property by nothing more than a narrow, grassy path. In taped interviews played later at trial, Sylvester told police that in the early hours of August 17th, somewhere around 1:30 or 2 a.m., he'd gone out for a walk on that path between the two houses. That's where he ran into Alicia. According to his account, she confronted him, swore at him, asked what he was doing lurking outside in the dark. He told her he had every right to be there. The exchange escalated. Alicia, he said, called him a loser, and that was the moment Sylvester claimed he lost control. He told police he slapped her, then pinned her down and slammed her head against the pathway repeatedly until she stopped breathing. In court, prosecutors painted a far more brutal picture than a slap, describing a sustained beating in which he struck her in the face, drove his knee into her chest, grabbed her by the hair, and slammed her head into the pavement 2 or 3 times. Whatever the exact sequence, the outcome was the same. Alicia Ross was dead, 10 feet from her own back door, while her mother slept inside. What Sylvester did next took hours. He moved her body into his garage, hosed the blood off the pathway, and lined the trunk of his mother's car with cardboard while his mother slept inside their shared house, completely unaware. He stripped Alicia's clothing and his own, bagged everything, and wrapped her head to control the bleeding before loading her into the trunk. Then he showered, changed, and around dawn drove roughly 45 kilometers northeast to a rural area near the small town of Manila, Ontario, where he dumped her body along with the bagged clothing. It was only afterward that he realized his own wallet, with his bank cards and driver's license inside, had gone into that same bag. For days he returned to the site trying to find it, but he'd hidden the bag too well and couldn't relocate it. That single mistake would haunt him for weeks, a live piece of evidence sitting out in a field with his name on it, waiting for the wrong hiker or farmer to stumble across it. Weeks later, panicking that police might eventually stumble onto the remains, he went back, moved what was left of the badly decomposed body, and hid it a second time, roughly 40 kilometers farther north, near the town of Coboconk, piece by piece, wrapped in a tarp, and driven north in the same trunk he'd used the first time. After his confession, detectives asked Sylvester to lead them to the site. He did. On September 21, 2005, searchers recovered what remained of Alicia Ross. Forensic anthropologist Catherine Gruspier, who later examined the remains for the prosecution, documented more than 30 separate fractures across Alicia's skeleton, her skull, her neck, her breastbone. 8 of her ribs trauma she compared in severity to injuries seen in fatal car or plane crashes. Because of how decomposed the remains were, no single, definitive cause of death could ever be pinned down. But the pattern of injury made one thing clear. This wasn't the result of one panicked shove. It was sustained, repeated violence. Daniel Sylvester was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The news landed like a shockwave, not because the neighborhood suspected someone unusual, but because it suspected no one at all. Sharon Fortas later said she'd only ever seen Daniel Sylvester in passing over the years they'd lived next to each other. He had no criminal record. He'd struggled since childhood with anxiety and depression, had a long history of being bullied, and by adulthood had become almost a recluse, rarely seen, barely known by anyone on the street he'd lived on for years. Sylvester pleaded not guilty to second-degree murder and tried, before the trial even began, to plead guilty instead to the lesser charge of manslaughter, arguing Alicia's death was the unintended result of a fight that spiraled out of control. The Crown rejected the plea outright. They wanted a jury to decide. The trial opened in May 2007, nearly 2 years after Alicia's death, in a courtroom in Newmarket, Ontario. Prosecutors argued this was no accident and no split-second loss of temper, pointing to everything Sylvester did in the hours and weeks that followed the killing as evidence of calculation, not panic. The hose-down pathway, the cardboard-lined trunk, the 2 separate burial sites chosen specifically to make Alicia harder to find. They argued he came forward not out of guilt, but because he knew his own driver's license, sitting in a bag with Alicia's bloodied clothes, was a ticking clock. The defense pushed back, leaning on Sylvester's lifelong struggles with mental illness and isolation, and on his own account that Alicia had provoked the confrontation by insulting him in the dark. It didn't help their case when a psychiatrist who'd evaluated Sylvester testified that he'd admitted to violent sexual fantasies involving strangers, including imagining jumping out from hiding to attack women, and that he had a documented history of exposing himself in public. For the jury, it reframed the killing from a chance encounter gone wrong into something that looked disturbingly premeditated. On May 29, 2007, after less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury of 8 women and 4 men found Daniel Sylvester guilty of second-degree murder. Sharon Fortis wept quietly as the verdict was read. At sentencing that July, Justice Ted Minden didn't hold back. He called it a brutal, vicious, and sustained beating, and an attack on a completely innocent young woman, rejecting Sylvester's claim that guilt alone had driven him to confess. In the judge's view, Sylvester's actions afterward were aimed at one thing only: saving himself. Minden set Sylvester's parole ineligibility at 16 years, within the mandatory life sentence that comes automatically with a second-degree murder conviction in Canada. And what about Sean Hine, the boyfriend an entire country had spent a month convinced was a killer? Once Sylvester's confession broke, at least one local newspaper issued a public apology for the way it had covered him. Hine had spent weeks being treated, in print and online, as a man who'd gotten away with murder. According to people close to him, that period was devastating. He'd lost the woman he was falling for, and then watched much of the public brand him a monster for it. In the years since, Daniel Sylvester's case has come up for parole review, most notably around 2021, drawing organized opposition from people determined to keep him behind bars. There's no public record confirming his release, which suggests he remains in custody today. Sharon Fortis has continued to speak publicly about her daughter over the years, and the family has worked to keep Alicia's memory tied to the things she loved, including the outdoor life she was passionate about as a young woman. What still haunts people about this case isn't just the violence of it, it's the geography. For over a month, an entire country searched highways, forests, and hotlines for a stranger who had taken Alicia Ross, while the man who killed her slept every night in the house right next door, close enough to hear her mother crying through the wall. So here's the question worth sitting with. How many other neighborhoods right now are one open gate away from the same silence? Thanks for watching.